you can start maybe just with a very brief introduction about yourself and your background and the book and what it's about. And then we'll delve into some of the kind of questions and thorny topics that it covers.
Okay. So yes, my last full-time role was as a regulator. I was a board member at Ofcom, the UK regulator of telecoms and media. One of the main things I was responsible for at Ofcom was a new regulatory framework that's designed to promote investment in fibre broadband. In putting that framework together, we tried to learn from previous failures, particularly previous failures of competition. And I decided that learning from history was just quite fun. You can learn from it, but it's also quite fun. So the book I wrote is called From Beacon Fires to Fibre Broadband, A History of Innovation, Enterprise and Regulation. It goes back about 200 years. The first real communications networks arrived in the 1790s when they replaced what we used to use before that, basically lighting fires on mountaintops. And the idea is to track the series of innovations which took us from basic telegraphs through to fibre broadband, but particularly look at the way in which what happened in different countries was shaped by the interaction between technological innovation, commercial enterprise, and regulatory intervention. The hypothesis is that sort of three-way interaction that's important. And I compared the way that worked in 4 countries, so the UK, the US, France, and Germany.
Fantastic. And obviously there are many perspectives on how and to what extent history and historical examples and solutions should and can inform what happens today. So I'm curious, for your perspective, thinking about some of the historical solutions and approaches adopted in terms of telecoms regulators, how relevant, how much can we learn from them in terms of current areas of technology, regulatory concerns, whether that's online platforms, AI? What lessons can we learn from telecoms regulation history?
Yeah, so actually at the end of the book, I had 3 sets of, I suppose, concluding remarks, and I titled them Past, Present, Future. The past was really about trying to make a dispassionate assessment of the history of state ownership, because for most of the time these networks have been controlled by governments. That's probably not so relevant for current debates. It's of historical interest. And then the other 2 bits, firstly, I was trying to assess what had worked in terms of telecoms regulation, and going forward, how much those parallels apply to the debate that's going on at the moment around digital platforms. And the key point is there are quite a few parallels between telecoms regulation and the regulation of digital platforms. So firstly, both telecoms networks and digital platforms tend to be associated with ecosystems that bring together devices, networks, and services. That tends to take regulators into debates about interoperability, the mechanisms by which those different components of an ecosystem talk to each other. Another important parallel is the importance of what we describe as network effects. So network effects, that's an economic characteristic according to which the value of a network simply depends on the number of connections it makes between people. And on that basis, a single large network is worth more than a large number of small networks because it makes more connections possible. So those are the parallels. There are some important differences, and it's important to bear these in mind because I think some policymakers assume they can directly lift and shift what we did with telecoms onto the digital platforms, and that's not right. One important difference relates to something called network interconnection. So network interconnection is the means by which different networks are connected together, so a person on one network can speak to someone on another network. That was probably the main battleground over probably about 100 years of telecoms regulation, because there's a long history of incumbent operators refusing to interconnect with upstart new entrants as a way of holding them back. That debate just doesn't arise for digital platforms because platforms that deliver services over the internet was designed from the start to support global connectivity, sort of the clues in the name. So that battleground of network interconnection is really much less relevant for digital platforms. And I think the other really big difference is around the historical context. You touched on this when you noted path dependence. The historical context is very different. Almost every current telecoms operator can trace its history back to a time when it was a state-owned incumbent with a guaranteed monopoly. Since liberalisation, they've still had to fight to protect those monopolies, so competition has had some effect. But digital platforms have had to carve out completely new markets for themselves, and they've had to do so in an environment where they faced competition from the start. And I think that's very different. There's a slight tendency amongst policymakers to assume that that's all done and dusted, that, if you like, the current state of digital platforms has now stabilized, and essentially they can be treated in the same way as we used to treat network monopolies. And I think that's a big mistake. That's really not learning from the lessons of history, because the one thing you can learn from history is you can't predict the future. The number of times when people have thought things are stabilized and something else came along, that's the repeat pattern. So I think it's really important to recognise that this classic Schumpeterian disruptive innovation that continues.
Yeah, absolutely. And I kind of just want to ask you a bit more about what you were saying about ecosystems,
Yes.
and actually link it to this piece about learning from previous failures.
Yeah.
Because I think often today, when we think, especially in kind of government and maybe regulatory contexts, about lesson learning, we often frame it in terms of institutional memory and institutional lesson learning. But actually, the nature of innovation and the types of innovations you're talking about is that they take place within an ecosystem with many different players. So I'm curious, I always think we should be thinking more about ecosystem memory rather than institutional memory and lesson learning. And I'm curious whether you think that is happening, whether more of it should happen, and if so, what it could or should look like.
I think more of, so I'm not sure if this is answering the question.
Yeah.
But for me, some of the most interesting examples of historical parallels relate to ecosystems and the experience gained with them. I wrote an article about 5 years ago, which was it was called Pressure to Regulate. At that point, the pressure to regulate AI was just emerging, toxic debate. But what I did was I went back to a debate that had played out 50 years previously, which was around one of the first interventions in an ecosystem. And this was a competition case that was taken by the Federal Communications Commission in the United States. The case was called Carterphone, and it concluded in 1968. Before that decision, most incumbent telephone operators, they refused to let consumers choose their own telephone. Yeah. They said that if you want a telephone, you've got to buy it from us. And if you connect your own telephone, there are all sorts of risks, up to including electrocuting yourself. So this is quite an apocalyptic description of what could go wrong if you chose your own telephone. What Carterphone did was introduce the idea of interoperability standards. It said that people should be able to choose their own telephone. It drew quite a nice parallel with what was then another hot topic, the space race. It said that, if you could build a spaceship from lots of different components, then you could probably do the same in a telephone network. But what you need was interoperability standards, and those standards were necessary, but also sufficient. They were necessary to protect people, but they were also sufficient. You didn't need to be more intrusive. And I think that, for me, is something we should remember now, because what I liked about it was a very targeted intervention. There was a specific concern and a specific harm, which that dealt with in a very targeted way. I think we need to remember that type of approach, because my worry about some of the current EU regulations, to a certain extent the UK as well, is that we've slightly lost that art of focusing on what really matters.
Yeah, that's interesting. And I think interoperability within the European context is actually something that you discuss in the book. And I'm really curious to hear a little bit more about that. So I think it's fair to say in the book you critique the EU mandating of interoperability across digital platforms. Can you say a little bit more about why you feel that it was premature, perhaps? And you also talk about multi-homing. So maybe you could say a little bit more about both what that concept is and why you think maybe it should have had a bit more room to breathe.
So the Digital Markets Act mandates two types of interoperability. one, let me take them in turn. The first is they call vertical interoperability. The idea of vertical interoperability is it allows developers of new software applications that are intended to work over the top of a device such as an iPhone or an Android phone. It gives the developers those applications access to various capabilities of the device operating system. And there's a bit of a parallel between that and what we used to with telecoms networks, where competing operators could gain access to key components of networks, the copper local loop, for example. The important difference is that what we used to with telecoms networks is we limited the scope of those access obligations to those facilities that really nobody could replicate. And the importance of that was that it stopped, it allowed competition, but it also ensured that those things that could get replicated by different people in different ways did. And that's what drove innovation. So there's something very important about the scope of those types of vertical interoperability obligations, which is keeping it very narrow around the capabilities that where there's no choice but to give access, if you like. And my worry about the Digital Market Act obligations is they're essentially unbounded. Of course, there's still discretion to not exploit that fully, but on the face of it, the obligations are unbounded. So that's, I think, a problem. And that, particularly if you're worried about innovation. The other set of obligations are described as horizontal interoperability obligations. What those do is they require different messaging platforms to interoperate with each other, so that a message you send from one platform, say WhatsApp, can be received on another, say iMessage or something. Now, firstly, that also risks innovation, because you're now in a situation where those application platforms can't innovate independently of each other. They have to agree whenever they do anything new. But also, I think it's just unnecessary. So this is where multi-homing comes in. So multi-homing is the mechanism by which we all install lots of messaging apps on a single device, and we tend to use them interchangeably. I think that means it's not necessary for those apps to talk to each other. Most of us can cope with switching between a few different apps. And I think the market should have been given a chance to see if that was sufficient.
And I suppose multi-homing also promotes competition in the sense that people don't want to be overwhelmed and therefore are going to be somewhat selective. What they're multi-homing, but to some degree.
Yeah, they're multi-homing. You'll never have 100 different apps, and I think that goes again to, what's a realistic degree of competition? So you're only ever going to have a few applications in the tech sector that survive. But what multi-homing allows a reasonable degree of competition, but importantly, it allows competition that's differentiated. Yeah. So something I've always hated a bit is that there is a certain type of competition which is very intense, but all the services look identical. And that's essentially resale competition. When everyone is reselling the same service, consumers have a lot of choice, but that choice is really a chimera. What I think is most interesting is when competition is between somewhat different types of services, actually.
Yeah. Yeah, that's really interesting. And maybe to continue down the line of some of the aspects of regulation that you critique in the book, if that's okay. You also talk about the idea of a couple of different roles, I think, that you perceive regulators to play. And you say that one of them is about actually kind of supporting and ensuring that the next generation of entrepreneurs aren't held back by current incumbents. And then you also talk about them embracing the achievements of those who have been successful, who are successful. And you actually say quite specifically that you think that regulators in general are maybe more comfortable with the first of those goals than the second, which I think is a really interesting perspective. So maybe you can say a little bit more about that, and perhaps thinking about the UK context, what could it look like for regulators to embrace the achievements of those who are successful? And what do you think doing so would help unlock, would help achieve?
No, sure. And I wrote that very carefully. I do worry about this. So it's part tone, part substance.
Exactly.
On tone, most regulators see their primary role as promoting competition, and that's of course fair enough. The problem is that if that's the prism through which you see everything, then some of the main indicators of commercial success, so that scale and profit, can start looking like symptoms of a problem. And there's a tendency to describe them as such. And you can see that if you look at almost every regulatory report on any market, you tend to see profit and scale described as a problem, a challenge for new entrants. It is a challenge, but it can also be good. And that takes me to the substance, actually, because the truth is that most tech markets, you have to have scale to be globally competitive. We are never going to get lots and lots of players in most tech markets, whether that's mobile phone operating systems or cloud computing facilities. You can have a few, but you're never going to have many. For me, the most existential question for both European policymakers and particularly for the UK, it's not whether you can create more mobile phone ecosystems, but why they're all American. The real challenge, I think, for Europe is, how have we failed when it comes to at least having some skin in the game when it comes to upstream platforms? And that's illustrated if you look at, it's quite interesting, I was looking at the Competition Markets Authority in the UK has just published its designation of Apple and Google as having gatekeeper status when it comes to mobile phone ecosystems. The European Commission has made similar decisions in the past. And in both cases, don't disagree with those decisions, but what's interesting about those decisions is they tend to focus an awful lot on the challenges faced by app developers trying to provide services over the top of Apple and Google's platform. And there's a whole series of well-documented concerns about what it's like to be an app developer, but almost nothing is said about how we can get platforms in Europe that have the scale to compete directly with Apple and Google, rather than just provide services over the top. And I would like us, I suppose the symptom of success for me, what I'd like to see change in the UK is more of a discussion about that aspect of platform competition, not just the ability to provide services over the top of American platforms.
Absolutely. And it's, of course, also the case that if you're going to grow larger markets, you need companies that operate at scale.
Yeah.
And
that's right. And that's why scale can be problematic if you're a new entrant. I feel for a startup, the first job I had in telecoms was working for a company that was trying to use wireless technology to take on an incumbent operator. So I get what it feels like, but long-term success, if we've been successful, the whole point would have been to get big. And that should have been a cause for success rather than anything, a cause for celebration rather than anything else.
Exactly. And maybe this links to something we were talking about before we started recording, which is the kind of your long view of the role of regulation and innovation, perhaps. Can you say a little bit more about that and kind of, I suppose, maybe the roles and limitations that you see regulation playing if we're thinking about innovation as a kind of long run system or phenomena? And I think with that, whether there's path dependency, does regulation create certain path dependencies when it comes to innovation?
Yes. So there's a fundamental problem with regulation, which is obvious, I'm afraid, which is that you can use regulation to create more competition. But if regulation becomes very intrusive, then essentially the regulator is determining what the market delivers. So, that's not really where you want to be. I think the sweet spot for me is where regulators are able to intervene in a way that makes markets a bit more contestable, by making it easier to build competing services, but doesn't dictate what they look like. A good current example is actually the work that we did in the UK to promote investment in fibre broadband, but several other countries have done as well, where essentially regulation limits itself to mandating the sharing of dumb infrastructure, dumb assets. So different operators share the same ducts and poles. They use those ducts and poles to lay their own fibre, but no more. So for me, that's quite a good model, because it's a form of regulation that, say, it makes markets more contestable, but doesn't determine outcomes. There are bad examples, though, and that probably comes to the path dependence point, where there are plenty of examples where markets have developed in a way that's been shaped by regulatory intervention, by policy. There was quite an interesting example I looked at back in the 1990s, when we all started trying to move from telephone networks to digital multi-purpose networks capable of carrying voice, video, and data. Across Europe, there was a big impetus to implement a particular technology called ISDN, Integrated Service Digital Network. And this became a bit of a cause célèbre across the EU. In fact, it was seen as the first opportunity in many ways to create a digital single market. But it basically failed because it turned out to be a bit of a crap technology. It was, that's probably a bit unfair. No, it was rather backward-looking technology. It was a technology which was quite evolutionary. It built on existing telephone networks, slightly extended their capability, but not in a very dramatic way. So in particular, not enough bandwidth to support video, and a network architecture that didn't really play to the emerging world of packet switching networks, which is what everyone was interested in. So ISDN was a classic example of European incumbents building on the past. What then emerged from the United States was technology ADSL, which used a very similar set of techniques, technical means to digitize telephone lines, but it was much more radical in the way it thought about the services it should deliver. It wasn't just about telephony, it was about broadband data, and in particular enough capacity to deliver videos. And as it turns out, from the 2000s onwards, it was DSL that really transformed things. It was DSL that drove the first generation of broadband, frankly, across the world. So that's an example for me of why it's important not to be too captured by the past.
Yeah, interesting. And you've obviously drawn on some different regulatory regimes there. And I think this is something that really you have a lot of experience in, the kind of international dimension. Both, I suppose, in kind of understanding the regulatory approaches that different countries, different regions are taking, but also actually some of the negotiations that go on internationally within that. And I think I'm right in saying that you were vice chair of BEREC, which is the body which brings together European regulators of electronic communications. And in the book, you both discuss comparative examples, particularly from France and Germany, among others, as well as the UK. In those settings, how important has coalition building been for the UK in international standard setting? And again, now thinking about the present, how do you see that evolving in relation to AI, where obviously there's a lot of discussion at the moment about standard setting?
So that's a really good question. I mean, standards have always been intrinsically international. The first standards go back to the 1850s. Actually, I think it was the German Confederation that first started trying to link together the telegraph networks in the different states of the Confederations for the unification of Germany, and agreed Morse code as the means of doing that. So standards have always been driven by international politics. That was certainly my experience on BEREC and also in the ITU, which is, I guess, the global standards body. Fortunately, I think the UK was always influential. We were always listened to, but it was also always clear that economic clout mattered. I remember, for example, a BEREC delegation going to India to try and negotiate an MOU with the Indian regulator around the topic of net neutrality. And the truth is, you have more clout when you're representing 450 million people than when you're representing 76 or whatever it is at the moment in the UK. So that the clout that comes with a large market is really critical. And that then comes to your question about going forward. Going forwards, I think the truth is there are three power blocks that matter most. And you know what they are? They're the US, China, and the EU. The great tragedy is that the UK, we've somehow managed to damage relationships with all three over the last 10 years. 10, 15 years ago, we had a pretty good relationship with all three of those power blocks. Now we don't. And I don't know what the easy answer, there isn't an easy answer to fixing that, but I think a good starting point, an obvious starting point, given the current state of geopolitics, would be to rebuild some bridges with the EU. I don't really see an alternative to that. And it's not that we are, there was an interesting discussion I was having last week about where the UK sits when it thinks about regulation compared to the EU and the US. And I think we are definitely the liberal end of the spectrum compared to most EU countries, but also more European when you compare us to the US. So the EU is not homogenous, but I think the role we played in the EU was both beneficial to us. It gave us clout that we don't otherwise have, but I think it was also beneficial to the EU in terms of promoting a slightly more liberal approach.
Yeah. And I'm wondering, obviously, there's a lot of discussion at the moment about China and its role in standard setting and its kind of co-opting of other countries in support, let's say. How anxious or concerned are you about that role?
Gosh, that's a really good question, because I was heavily involved because of my role in telecoms. I had a lot of dealings with Huawei, and it was around Huawei that a lot of this, the politicization of these issues started. And I think that was a great tragedy, because the truth is, I think we have to deal with China. I don't approve of the human rights record from China, same as many other countries. I think we have to find a way, though, of doing business with China, because it's a large market and there are some brilliant people there as well. Some of the innovation that comes out of China is pretty neat as well. So for me, I think sooner or later, we are going to have to mend bridges with China and find ways of working with them when it comes to global standards, because I don't see how we can just ignore them.
Yeah, and what kind of, building on your experience of this, are there specific approaches that you feel would be more valuable than others?
I think there are, I think it is recognizing that there is some common ground. So we have very different values when it comes to democratic values, free expression, and so on. But but we both care about prosperity, and we can find ways of working with China on in the interests of mutual economic prosperity. And I'm not saying you can completely decouple that from questions around human rights and freedom of expression, but I think you have to do that a bit.
Yeah, okay, great. I definitely want to end on a positive note, but maybe before we get there, I think it's both interesting and sometimes fun, as you mentioned before, to learn about some of the failures that we've seen historically. I'm curious if there's an example from the book that stands out to you as a failure that's particularly instructive, let's say.
Yes, okay. Actually, what I was quite interested in, for a few, but let me just pick one. Towards the end, about I guess 1880 or so, the telephone arrived. So at the point the telephone arrived, we already had a number of very well established companies that ran telegraph networks. So the big disruption in 1880 was when it was no longer just about sending digital telegraph messages to each other, but analog speech. That was the big disruption of the late 19th century. It turns out, though, that a lot of incumbents naturally resisted that. The telegraph networks that were already in place resisted the new invention. They wanted to control it. In the US, that wasn't a problem because the incumbent network was a private company and it basically couldn't stop the Bell system emerging. But what happens in Europe, and certainly in both the UK and France, was that the incumbent operator was the government. So there's quite interesting episodes where the telephone arrived in the UK. The state telegraph company allowed private telephone companies to operate, but tried to control them and attached all sorts of conditions to the way telephones were used to stop them competing directly with the telegraph. So one example is that the government stopped the telephone being used for long distance calls. The private telephone companies were allowed to provide telephone calls locally, but only the state was allowed to carry telephone calls over long distances. Because that would compete directly with its telegraphy revenues. That basically held back telephony in the UK. So by the end of this period, telephony in the UK was a long way behind where it had got to in some other countries.
I'm reminded of the book, The Blunders of Our Government, by Anthony and Ivor Crew. I think the title maybe fits the bill here.
Well, that's right, yes. And there is something about state-sponsored protectionism, which is a recurring theme. And protectionism is bad enough, but when it's the state, it's particularly problematic.
Okay, so let's maybe end on a positive note, as I mentioned. And let's think about maybe a technological innovation or some technological innovations that you're excited about for the future, that you think hold potential to bring meaningful value to people over the next, let's think about the next 10 years, not do too much kind of forecasting, but over the next 10 years, is there some form of technological innovation that you're particularly excited and inspired by, first of all? And secondly, how would you like regulators to then engage with that innovation?
So I have a two-part answer. Actually, the first part of my answer is what I don't want to say, because I think right now it's quite difficult not to reply to that question with an answer that includes AI, because of course everyone is interested in AI at the moment, and I get that. I do worry about the amount of hype associated with AI at the moment. And I do worry about what's the role of governments and regulators. In particular, I think we need to be very careful that regulators don't see it as their role too quickly to try and control what happens with AI. Because I think what we've seen with some of the controversy around the Online Safety Act is that if you try to go too fast and too broad when it comes to regulation, you can trip over yourself. So AI is one of the answers, but actually it's not the answer I want to give, because what I still find exciting is basic connectivity. Nothing else is possible in the digital world unless you can connect people with a reliable service and enough bandwidth. Nothing else is possible without that. And it is still the case that a large number of people are not well enough connected. That's especially true in the developing world, but it's also true to a certain extent in the developed world. So what I actually found exciting is, truthfully, rather boring pipes and wires, getting those everywhere, and looking for creative ways of extending their reach. So right now, looking at what low Earth orbit satellites such as Starlink and Kuiper are able to do. For years, we said that satellite would never be able to do fiber type services, and maybe now it can, at least in some use cases. So that's the thing that still excites me, is getting the basic infrastructure in place that connects everyone. And you asked about the role of regulators. I think this is the core task of regulators, to make sure that everybody is connected, because otherwise we're excluding people from society.
Yeah, that's a fantastic answer. And I think there are many interesting and creative examples that are emerging. Particularly, this is something I've seen in Latin America, where especially across urban and rural divides as well, but also within cities, you have very, very high levels of inequality in this regard.
Yeah.
And I think we've been seen in the UK, you know, we think in the UK, perhaps more broadly in Europe, that there are very high levels of connectivity, which, yes, is the case. But then when we think about the quality of connectivity, it's a bit more varied. So I think it's such an important question and area for us to be thinking about globally, really. And I think it's a really good note to end on, bringing us back to the reality and keeping us grounded on the kind of foundational piece that needs to be there.
And I'd also add, I think we can be optimistic, because I think it is a soluble problem. It's not an easy problem, but I think it's a soluble one if we apply enough focus to it.
Highly recommend the book. I'm deep into it, and it's a great read, as I think probably will become clear just from this conversation. There are lots of stories in it, lots of historical examples, but also some reflection on the present and where we're up to today, and how we should be thinking about these kind of big technological innovations and their future direction of travel. So thank you so much both for bringing all of that together in the book and for the conversation today.
And thanks, it's been a great conversation. Nice to talk to you.
Great.